We're now going to talk about the environment and sustainability perspectives and what we mean by better roads. Effectively, people want more roads and they want to drive around. That's obviously quite often not very good for the environment. So we'll see how we can make that equation work. So first of all, let's hear from Stephen, who is Chief Executive of the Campaign for Better Transport.
I'm going to describe a report that we've submitted on behalf of something like 17 different groups for the road investment strategy on what we think should happen in RIS 2 in relation to environment and sustainability. See whether this works. Yes, so this is what the report is. We've proposed some new performance metrics and case studies. Our priorities are three key principles: fixing it first, an integrated approach, and environmental leadership, with 5 themes for action, which I'll go through in a minute. So, fix it first. Continuing the discussion from the last session, we want to see more emphasis on fixing the roads we've got, rather than providing new capacity, with a focus on safety and maintenance, and also a green retrofit. Part of our argument is that not enough attention has ever been given to the environmental performance of the road network and providing high environmental standards. And we want to see the innovation that's happened in RIS 1 mainstreamed into RIS 2 as a business as usual, with new road capacity as a last resort. Our second theme principle was an integrated approach, with an integrated multimodal approach to planning transport corridors, sustainable development of homes, and partnership working with better connections with other networks. And our third is environmental leadership, having Highways England and the government lead on cutting CO2, improving air quality, reversing a decline in biodiversity, and having a whole systems approach with natural interventions where possible. Just briefly going through our 5 themes for action. So, low carbon future, things like rolling out electric vehicle charging points. Landscape and heritage, stronger protection for landscape and heritage for road schemes. There's an issue in some of the RIS 1 schemes and some of those coming up for RIS 2 about how strong the protection should be, and I think that will become an increasing issue. Enhancing biodiversity, we've been championing the idea of green bridges to connect wildlife areas across motorways and trunk roads. There's a very good one coming in, on the A38, and we want to see more of that. Protecting our health with quieter road services to reduce noise pollution. It's interesting that in the transport focus work today, in fact, motorists talk about the need for quieter road surfaces because they notice it too. And reconnecting communities, better provisions for walkers, cyclists, equestrians and bus passengers. We've been on a bit of a mission with Transport Focus to have Highways England see buses and coaches as legitimate and important users of the trunk road network and also the impact of crossing it too. So we want to see some learning from good practice. That's, I think, the Green Bridge on the A38 that I mentioned. High-quality cycle design guidance has already been produced. We've already seen commitments to electric vehicle charging points at service stations, but we think there's opportunities to learn from others, from what's happened in the Netherlands, in California, and also from what the National Grid has done in terms of infrastructure projects. We've suggested better performance metrics, measuring outcomes rather than just activity. So, ecological status of water, not the number of culverts, the usage of crossings, not only the number of crossing points, noise-reducing surfacing, not barriers and glazing, and drawing on best practice, using natural capital accounting, the zone of theoretical visibility to measure landscape impacts, and so on. On the designated funds, we want to see these retained in RIS 2, allocating the resources necessary to deliver the green retrofit effectively, better information, better partnership working, and engaging the expertise of the wider NGO sector. On design, one of the achievements for Highways England and the RIS1 has been to set up a design panel, and we want to see this retained and resourced to engage with key schemes at the concept stage, retaining oversight throughout the design and delivery process on sensitive schemes, and conduct a post-opening review to see whether the design objectives were actually met. We think there's a need for an evidence-based approach. CPRE produced, the Campaign to Protect Rural England produced a report on End of the Road which pointed out the evidence that in many cases increased road capacity fails to relieve congestion, and sometimes you see environmental damage with limited economic benefit, and therefore argues that new road capacity should be a last resort. We did some work on rail freight and found that in some cases, particularly on what one might call the central motorway box and in links to ports like Felixstowe and Southampton, transferring 2,000 lorry loads a day to rail would take the equivalent of taking 8,000 cars off the road. And our argument was that there's plenty of potential for rail freight in certain circumstances to make a big impact on congestion on the trunk road network. We also have submitted a bit of work on using data to make a difference. And I think there's a risk that for all the talk of smart roads and data, actually old road schemes die hard. And I notice England's economic heartland is still talking about widening the Northampton A45. And yet we had a piece of work done which showed that if you look at actually using mobile phone and postcode data, you can map car journeys on the trunk road, and worked out that a lot of them are 80% are single occupancy, and that there's an opportunity to prioritize car sharing, identify actual possibilities for new commercial bus routes, and potentially reduce 20% of the traffic on the corridor in doing that. And so we think that use of data needs to be prioritized in the next RIS. So that's our Rising to the Challenge report, which you can find on our website. Our next step, in conjunction with the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund and indeed with Steve Gooding, who has in our last session, has been to set up a Greener Roads project to identify what does good look like in road design. What's the scope for environmentally focused road schemes and green retrofit, and what does UK and international best practice look like? So in summary, our vision for Greener Roads is fix it first, improving the current network, green retrofit, new road capacity as a last resort, integrated approach, corridor planning, joining up with other modes and other networks, environmental leadership with a system-wide focus on low carbon, air quality and biodiversity, and committing resources to deliver greener roads. Thank you.
So, ladies and gents, good afternoon. Stephen's given a view from a perspective about how can roads reduce their impact on the environment. I want to give you a slightly different perspective for my short talk. And if I start off, let's just put this in perspective. When we design pieces of infrastructure as a business, they are there for a long time. So if we design roads, if we design the rail network of the future, typically we get a design brief of about 110 years for that. Even if we come away from roads and think about the buildings that we design, the M&E systems for those who have a design life of 25 years, and if we talk about things, our iconic project outside infrastructure, things like the Shard, well, you know what? You could take the Shard down if you wanted to, but it would cost you a whole lot more than it did to put it up, and it would take you a whole lot longer. So worldwide, on a planned basis, only 4 skyscrapers have ever been taken down across the world. So as engineers, when we design those, my goodness, they'd better be good, because they are going to be there for a long time. And the starting point that WSP will come from is a program that I lead called Future Ready, which is, if we're going to design things that are going to be there for 100+ years, then yes, we want to reduce their impact on the environment and reduce the impact on society and make them as valuable as they can be. But also we need to design them in a way that means that they are ready both for today and also that they're ready for the future. And by understanding that future more clearly than others, we have a really clear view in the business. A, that if we just design to code, then that gets us some way to the future. But my goodness, there's a whole barrel load of other things that we are anticipating will change out into the future. Well, how can we address those? And then not just saying how can we address them, but for us as a business, if we can get our 37,000 staff across the world working and designing to that and engaging with clients, that's a much better service from us. And it's leading us as designers and engineers rather than just slavishly following, for example, what an architect does or necessarily what code is requiring. And it's a much richer and a deeper service as a business. So let me give you some examples of that. I'll give you 3 examples of that. And the first one, kind of it starts off as we know, which is how do we design for a future climate? Well, yes, if we design new roads right now, then DMRB, which is as engineers, that's our Bible. Yes, that considers that in some detail. But let's have a look at projects like this. So things like Westway, which is a project that we're just working on now. So when we're looking at retrofitting and renovating that for the next 50 years, it's virtually a no-cost option for us to be thinking about, what? Over the next 50 years, we already know from Environment Agency forecasts that it's going to rain a whole lot heavily. So it's a zero-cost option for us just to improve the rainwater collection system and immediately make that a much safer system. For hotter weather as well, we run Northamptonshire's road network in partnership with Kia. It's just easy for us to start thinking, A, about the drainage, but also just thinking about some of the tarmacs that we use so that if the roads are going to be running in much hotter temperatures, how can we, on a phased basis, as we are resurfacing roads, just start to get them ready for future peak temperatures so that the road doesn't necessarily melt in the future, but we know from previous experience that the road gets more tacky, and so when you get lorries and buses running over those surfaces, we know from previous summers that maintenance bills are much, much higher where you get rutting. So on a planned basis, we can just address that. And on things like Westway, actually it's also some simple things which, for those of you who are engineers, were kind of techie on this. There's things like expansion joints. Just changing out expansion joints so that you're allowing the structure to expand more because it's going to be hotter is really easy if you're doing it at the time of planned maintenance. It's a whole lot harder if you've got to start shutting down what is some of the busiest roads in the country to adapt to that. Second area is just think about future technologies. So here's just another simple example which kind of goes to the heart of engineers. So this is Transpennine Tunnel, which our Mushal colleagues have been working on and continue to do so. Well, you know what, with Transpennine Tunnel, that will be ready if it gets built, probably in about 20 years' time. And again, we have a design life of 110 years once it's been built. The challenge, and just one example of how we can help get that ready for the future, is if you think in 20 years' time, the vehicles that will be running through that will be much, much more electric-fueled, powered rather than petrol and diesel. Today, if we just follow code, the ventilation that we will design in for that tunnel is really entirely predicated on getting rid of diesel and petrol fumes. And also, if you are unfortunate enough for one of those vehicles to catch fire, then the burn characteristics for a battery-powered vehicle is entirely different from a petrol and a diesel vehicle. So even at the early stage of design, by thinking about these, engaging on these sorts of things with our clients, with Highways England and others, we're just getting ready for a design when, if it's built, is ready right away for that future, rather than being just slavishly following code, and you know what, the minute it's open, it's obsolete. And then the third area I want to talk about is it's a rich area for us as engineers because we don't generally get asked to talk about this. And that's how can we get ready for future societies. So we'll talk about older societies and we might have a piece of conversation in that. But I want to just talk to you a little bit and get your input on 2 trends that we're tracking. First of which is a trend to loneliness. So let me just do a quick show of hands. So, we asked 1,000 Londoners earlier this year how many names of their neighbours that they know. So, just think very quickly, and let me do a quick straw poll. How many of you know the names of 20 neighbours or more? Okay, very good. You are extremely social. More than 10. Okay. More than 5. Okay, and none. Okay, so you're generally a more social group. Maybe you're not all from London. But for our Londoners that we interviewed, 60% of Londoners know the names of 3 of their neighbours or fewer. And if you live in an apartment block, round about the same, about 60% know the names of not a single person who live in their apartment block. Now, what's really interesting about this is, at the moment, we have those conversations, and the answer is befriending charities or age concern and things such as that. But you know what? As designers, there's lots that we can do. So here's Poundbury, for example, ridiculed by some purists, but actually a really, really successful scheme. And if you want to talk about designing better roads, one of the things that this really addresses is the very, very clear evidence that exists that shows that the greater the traffic flow down your street, the fewer the names of your neighbours that you know. And that's kind of blindingly obvious, isn't it? Because if you have a roaring dual carriageway outside your house, you're not necessarily going to be engaging and talking to your neighbours and letting your kids play out there. But if we can think about this as engineers, and I promise you as engineers, there is lots that we can do around loneliness. We asked 400 of our teams, we got them together for 1 hour, and they came up with 250 ideas of how they as engineers could overcome loneliness on their projects. They just don't get asked that sort of thing. So there's one. And then let me ask you a second question. This is probably, I would say, one of my favorite graphs. And it tracks UK Google searches for one of 4 things. And again, this is a straw poll. There is a right answer, but it's a bit of fun. So hands up if you think that is a Google search trend graph for the past 5 years for my house price. Okay, for healthy. Okay, for whiskey. Okay, and thirdly, for petrol price. Okay, so the answer is healthy. And there's both a serious point and there's a flippant point on that. Actually, to note, if you chose whiskey, you're nearly correct. Whiskey is the mirror image of that Google search graph. The serious point is that there is a progressive upward trend. The slightly flippant point, which is why I always like showing it, is the heartbeat on January the 1st each year, with the gradual drift off of enthusiasm. And if you want a comparison for that, I did this same search for my Swedish colleagues. And you know what? If you search for the Swedish equivalent of healthy, it's just a straight line, straight across. There's no heartbeat or anything like that. So, but the serious point for us as designers is that explains why, again, if we talk to the same 1,000 Londoners, why air quality is the second most important issue for them after house prices in our survey today. And also it explains why, when we're designing roads, if we're designing better roads, you know it's not a static thing. It's not the same as it has been. That's why active travel is so important. And that's why, when we're designing roads, why there is this progressive need and interest to design something more than just things that carry vehicles on them, and cars especially. So, ladies and gents, I can go on. We're tracking a whole bunch of other trends. That's just the quickest snapshot. The key challenge that I would lead you for is, in WSP, that's something that's driving our work, but we kind of all know that as leaders in our sector and as senior people who are here. We know that the future is going to be different. The key challenge for us when we're designing roads is how can we really translate that into action and design something different than what we designed before. Thank you.
Stephen, there's been so much talk today of the environment and how important it is, and we've had this investment strategy from the government, and it talks about environment and stuff. But isn't it really the impossible equation? What people want is, lots more clear roads to drive on, and they inevitably are bad for the environment.
I think it'll depend on whether people are actually prepared to put some money into this. The government did put, having learned from but I think it's something they have to do, because otherwise they don't get consent. I hope the roads community won't have to go through to relearn the lessons from the 90s and Twyford Down and so on, where they had people standing in front of bulldozers, before they did what the government did do at Hindhead and put a tunnel and spend the money on tunnelling to make some roads better. And what we've discovered from the project we're doing at the moment for East Jeffreys is that other countries do spend the money on environmental quality, and that makes a difference. A really specific example, which we've just come across, there's a big argument going on in Liverpool at the moment about a port access road, which is one of the RIS1 schemes. And Highways England said, well, you can either have it down your main road and demolish a lot of houses, or you can have it through a country park. And we did a bit of comparison with Rotterdam, faced similar issue, and they'd spent the money on sinking the road into cuttings, bit of tunnelling, so in a green space, so you can't actually see it. And our argument is, why should Liverpool have a worse environmental standard than Rotterdam in both port access roads? And so some of this is simply about spending the money. And we know from conversations with Highways England that they're split about this. The older people there are kind of going, why are we spending money on green bridges? We just get on and lay the tarmac, don't we? And the people who are newer and are thinking about how Highways England as a long-term infrastructure provider and manager gets public consent are going, no, this is a part of the license to exist and to get public consent. So I think it's not a kind of either or. I think high environmental standards are going to be really important in the future.
David, this is interesting. You've come up with some lovely design ideas and ways to really improve the world, but how much more pricey is it to design something that's sort of more sustainable and greener, and how difficult is it to get the money out of people to actually build it?
I mean, I think the key, there is this constant assumption that it always is going to cost more. The reality is that quite a large amount of some of the things that we'll be talking about, actually they have lower total cost of ownership or zero impact if you include them in the design at the outset.
And that's also true because we've seen, I think Kia have shown us examples where they've, in their management of some trunk roads, they've put in wildflower seeds, and it doesn't cost them any more, but it massively enhances biodiversity on the trunk road verges. So that's a case where just thinking differently has made a difference and doesn't cost anything more.
Well, it sounds easy then and obvious, and particularly if it doesn't cost any more money. So why isn't it, do you think, happening more often? Is it just the message isn't getting through, or we're just stuck in our ways?
I think certainly as I've been finding for some of my conversations, I will give our engineers the challenge on this. I mean, I kind of learned quite frequently from mistakes that if I go in and say to our roads engineers or to my structural engineers, what you want to be doing is this. Generally, you know what, it's a fairly short conversation. Yeah. But actually one thing that engineers are great at is if you give them the challenge, then that's what engineers are for. They like really difficult challenges. And sometimes I think it is a question of actually framing the question and asking them to do something different. And then they're bang up for it, in my view.
I think that short-term benefit-cost ratios tend to kill that kind of inventiveness, actually. If you say, in transport generally, not just in roads, if you say, oh, well, we've done the benefit-cost ratio and we've discovered that country park's worth X, so we're not going to think about what we do with it, then, of course, nobody will do anything. But if you say, how could you maximize the benefits of this road, you get a different answer. Yes. And you can involve engineers much more clearly. I do think there are some larger questions. My point about data, I think that some of this is about rethinking old concepts and thinking, well, actually, could we make better use of the roads we've got with the technology we've got, rather than just keeping on laying the concrete. And I think there's more than ever, and some of the exhibition stands out there show that you can do that, and that gives you huge benefits environmentally, but also in terms of economic efficiency.
Well, guys, thank you both very much. We're gonna have